Good morning. Welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. Amber Affey will dispute the claims that a large portion of pregnant women miscarried after taking the Pfizer shot. And then the Hill's foreign policy staff writer Laura Kelly will join us from the ground in Ukraine.
But first, we want to bring you some results from the primary races that took place in New York, Florida, and Oklahoma. Congressman Jerry Nadler defeated Carolyn Maloney in New York's 12th district, while Val Demings won the Democratic nomination to face off against Senator Marco Rubio in Florida.
And then in Florida also, former Republican Governor Charlie Crist won the Democratic position to take on DeSantis in November. And then in Oklahoma, Madison Horn won the Democrats' runoff in the Senate, while Trump-endorsed Markwayne Mullin won the Republican nomination for the state's Senate seat. NewsNation's Leland Vittert joins us now to discuss some of these results. Leland, thanks for being with us.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, great to have you. So what, in your opinion, were the big takeaways from last night?
The one thing about primary elections is that you can kind of have something in it for everybody. I think there wasn't any real surprises in the results you just read, Robbie. The special election in New York that went Democratic. This is now the fourth special congressional election since the Dobbs decision, all of which won by Democrats by larger margins than President Biden won that congressional district. So if you had one takeaway, I think it's that we are seeing a change from what you and I would have talked about in May, which was this looming red wave out there on the horizon coming toward shore. And Democrats are slowly flipping that on its head, whether it be the Kansas abortion referendum or in the special election that we saw last night.
Yeah. Well, there was some messiness in New York's 10th district for Democrats. Congressman Mondaire Jones was defeated by Trump impeachment counsel Daniel Goldman for the Democratic primary in that district. Also, 25-year-old progressive activist Maxwell Frost won the Democratic primary and will be the most likely become the first Gen Z member of Congress. He was supported by Bernie Sanders. So it was a kind of a mixed bag for progressives because of the messy redistricting in New York's 10th. A whole slate of progressives were kind of stacked up against each other in that district. And we saw a late in the race endorsement from Nancy Pelosi come through for Mondaire. Didn't seem to help him very much. What do you make of that outcome there?
Low voter turnout primarily, and as you point out, that you have an impeachment counsel who was sort of a very standard bearer, Democratic, middle of the road candidate defeat the progressive. Then you have Frost win, who's the much more progressive candidate in another district. This is going to happen, especially in a place like New York, where you're dealing with small voter turnout and an enthusiastic base when it comes to different individual candidates. I'm not, they're interesting. And when you dig down about Frost and about the first Gen Z congressman, when you dig down about Goldman and exactly sort of how he ran this race is sort of a typical Democrat in the New York, almost Mario Cuomo like brand. They're interesting. I'm not sure on a national level how important they are or how much they tell us about what's coming or where the Democratic Party is really shifting. There probably was not something last night, and I hate to pour cold water on a segment or a hypothesis, but I don't think there was a primary last night that was like the AOC victory 4 years ago that sort of was like, holy cow, what a wake-up call. You wake up on Wednesday morning and the world has changed politically.
Not a wake-up call, but as you said, I want to go back to what you said a minute ago. Warning signs, certainly, for Republicans. If we flash back to beginning of the summer, a time when inflation out of control, gas prices, Biden with very low poll numbers, Republicans looking like they can do no wrong or feeling like they can do no wrong. Now in the wake of, I think, several things you identified, the Dobbs decision, some of these candidates being, especially in the national platform candidates in Arizona, Georgia, other places, being further right than than those states would support based on their most recent electoral performances. And what else? What is the other factor? Is there something? Is it Trump being kind of back front and center again with the Mar-a-Lago news that there's this chunk of voters who might vote for Republicans, but only if like the Trump faction is off screen?
The great questions. You'd think in Pennsylvania that the Trump faction would actually be more helpful if they came out. That's how Trump won Pennsylvania back in 2016. Robbie, I think you make a great point when you bring up those states. And what we're seeing, and I had a long conversation with Hugh Hewitt this morning about it, who takes the other side of this, but I think we're seeing that at least on the senatorial level, the statewide level, the actual quality of the candidates really matters. And when voters are seeing Herschel Walker talk about sending clean air over to China, when they hear Dr. Oz walk through a grocery store aisle and call a veggie tray coup d'etat, which I'm sure my French teacher would be annoyed at my pronunciation. When you really dig into Blake Masters' background in Arizona, and you have a situation where there's enough money on the Democratic side to really expose those individuals for who they are, voters don't particularly like them. And I think one of the things that you're going to see over the next 2 months, we're already seeing it, is where Mitch McConnell is going to put his money, because these guys can't raise money on their own, where he's going to put his money to try to save certain seats, just simply to preserve Republican seats. It doesn't appear as though that they have enough, the Republican establishment does, to save all of them.
Well, you said a little bit earlier that you didn't think that these races were necessarily a referendum on some of these bigger questions that get asked. Are we now out of a Trump era into a DeSantis era? Is this a progressive wave like the one we saw in 2018, or is this proof positive that blue dogs are the way to go? And I do expect that some of those narratives are going to come out of New York's 10th, despite that not really being the case, because if you look at the breakdown, the conversation is largely centered on the fact that if Neo or Jones, the two so-called progressive candidates, were not in this race, if either of them had dropped out, it seems likely that the other would have won, with Goldman only winning 25% of the vote, Neo with 23, and Jones with 18. And I'm curious what you make of Jones's decision to even run in the 10th district instead of staying in his more Westchester adjacent district, and really gambling on the idea that people in that Manhattan district weren't going to mind that he wasn't a resident of that district, that he was a newcomer, and would kind of, I guess, accept the fact that he was redistricted out of where he would prefer to be.
Boy, Brianna, you have me thoroughly out of my league in terms of the nuance of Republican politics. And what I would say is I have absolutely no idea. It's just not something that we get as granular about on the show. But at the same level, I think the fact that we'd have to get that granular to try and get some type of bigger meaning out of it tells you there may not be a bigger meaning. I think there's really important answers to all the questions you asked, none of which I have, but at the same level, it speaks to just sort of how individual those answers are to New York and to these districts and to these candidates, rather than having some national meaning.
Well, and I think that's a point I would make here in the Jones Goldman race. Goldman did run a campaign very focused on what I would say are sort of resistance liberal issues, talking about election integrity, or not, talking about the Republican attacks on election integrity and the threat to democracy and all those kinds of things that your MSNBC voters are concerned about. And maybe that's really a successful playbook in New York right now, given, the composition of sort of your New York liberals. Is that a good message, nationally? Is that something, Pelosi is going to want Dems everywhere to talk about that instead of what the party is doing to, fix the economic situation?
Yeah, well, it was also a close race, and he got the New York Times endorsement, as we discussed on this show. There was some feeling that he wouldn't because of the closeness of his family to the owners of the New York Times, and some what people thought was a little bit of bad optics there. He was, in many ways, a candidate with the establishment advantage, and you would expect this. And in some ways, the story is that it seems like it would have been a blowout if either progressive hadn't been in the race, and whether or not this is a real wake-up call for the decision-making as progressives try to grow their ranks in Congress, whether or not there needs to be a little bit more sportsmanship at play.
Well, sportsmanship in politics? Come on.
Yeah.
The 1970s are calling and would like their view of the world back. Robbie, I think you brought up a great point about sort of the election integrity thing, and I would remind everybody, these are primaries. These aren't general elections. The only sort of real general election test we have of what works and what doesn't, and granted this was going back to November, is Glenn Youngkin winning in Virginia. He wins by +2 or 3 in a Biden +10 state. And he did that by talking about kitchen table issues while Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, talked about Trump, election integrity, Trump bad, election integrity.
Right.
So you've got that side of it. And then we saw last night down in Florida.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Go ahead.
Ron DeSantis's Republican-backed school board candidates sweep the ticket and run the night. And I think that shows you that issue of parental control in schools is also going to be a deciding factor in November. And between those 2 points, I think you find a lot of the answers that we're looking for.
Yeah, and if there was going to be backlash, some accusing those critics of DeSantis saying he's overreaching by some of the things he's doing, you certainly didn't see it in those results to the extent it was a referendum on how he's handling those issues. It was very, very popular, at least in that county, in Miami County. We're going to talk about that more in depth in a little bit. Leland, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Good to see you. Thank you both for the time.
And we'll have Brianna's Radar up next. Stick around for that.